I think one thing you have to wrap your head around to understand these states of mind, it kind of comes out most clearly when you see family members or loved ones of someone who has killed themselves or maybe killed someone else and themselves at the same time. A person grieving is often feeling like a great deal of sadness for the person they lost. Like, oh, this poor person died and now they're gone and they must have been suffering so much. And that part is often a little easier to digest consciously if it's a loved one. But at the same time, I mean, and maybe this is controversial to say, but I think people feel this way and it's unavoidable that we feel this way. The person who killed themselves is also someone who engaged in an act of killing, an intentional act of killing.
Right.
They killed themselves,
Exactly.
but they are themselves a killer. And loved ones really, I think, have trouble bearing this, that at the same time they feel sadness and love for the person they lost, but a real outrage and hatred or all sorts of negative feelings, anger at the person who killed. But it's the same person.
You're back.
Yes.
Season 2.
Is it season 2? Oh yeah, you said that on.
Yeah, I said that on
previous.
It's season 2. We're doing it. It's season 2. I decided. I'm the boss. We're going for it.
Season 2, episode 2.
Episode 2.
If it's British, you could call it the second series. Don't
It's
they do
the
that?
second series. Yeah. I got thousands of people waiting for this. My phone is just off the hook ringing to get you back. So thank you for being here.
Oh wow. Yeah.
It's a tough transition because today we're not talking about something funny. We're talking
Like
about
trauma.
like trauma, which is hilarious. Today we are talking about suicide.
Yeah.
Pause, audience, before you start keyboard warriors. We're speaking to suicidology, really, insofar as understanding our quite shared frustrations and misunderstandings globally and sort of missing parts of what gives rise to something like suicidality and homicidality, and essentially our discomfort as a culture, maybe worldwide, with that possibility that could happen. So we're speaking to it in the ontological sense and obviously the psychoanalytic sense, and also, of course, in the plain English sense. So thank you again for being here. I'm excited for this conversation, which is a weird thing to say again, but it's meaningful and important because people really don't understand what the internal dyad or dynamics are that could really generate that type of harm and violence and depression.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the thing I wanted to say off the bat too, and it really struck me as you were talking, you can feel this real dilemma talking about suicide. Like there are ways in which, there was the famous example of the Netflix documentary, 13 Reasons Why, where there's a character who's, I think, completes suicide or is at least contemplating it. And they say, in the media, then that can increase the likelihood that people kill themselves. It's demographically measurable. Thankfully, no one listens to our podcast. So yeah. But on the other hand, there is this way in which it's such a difficult topic to broach, and it gets broached so rarely that I think people who are feeling like, boy, I'd just like to talk about this, feel a kind of wall around them. Like everybody's making these worrisome, things like, if you're suicidal, please call this number. Or there's a way in which that does also put up a wall and makes it harder for people who are feeling suicidal to share that.
Right. We both felt compelled, seemingly wholeheartedly, as far as we understand ourselves, to talk about this, not only because of patient work, but our personal anecdotes. But nonetheless, even in the meta analysis or the frame of this very conversation, I struggle to make that transition between wanting to be solemn and serious and value the significance of that form of suffering, at the same time still be human, which that line is so hard to toe respectfully and earnestly. And here we are speaking to, it's not broached well, it's not talked about well, It's spoken at conferences. I've certainly read papers and listened to lectures at suicidology conferences, but to the layperson, it's riddled with defenses and neuroses and
Yeah.
shame and guilt and persecution and judgment of the highest degree, as we spoke to previous to the recording, of this person was either incredibly weak to do such a thing, as we've discussed, or incredibly strong to overcome their will to live. And people are very, very hot and heavy and splitty in
Yeah.
their inability to tolerate what the complexity and complications of what's going on inside of somebody under such duress.
Yeah. And I think it's that latter question that we're really interested in. And I think through a psychodynamic, psychoanalytic lens, which is how both of us tend to think about it. There's just so much to say, though. Like you were saying, you can even feel there's something difficult here to talk about. And it's
Sure.
difficult for two reasons, I think. One is when someone is suicidal, that they've been pushed past the ordinary. And so their mind is somewhere that we don't find ourselves ordinarily or often, or at least many of us don't. And so there's already a kind of like a sort of empathic stretch that we have to engage in to really understand somebody
Right.
who's really sort of been pushed past their limits, or any pushed past anyone's limits. And then on the other hand, there are all these collective and individual defenses and resistances to just even thinking about the topic, never mind talking about it. There's a kind of shame around it. There's a kind of taboo around it. And we all have defenses around it. Like, oh my goodness, like theoretically, I could wind up in a state like that, but I can't even go there. It's just too intense to think that not only could my life be in danger, but I could feel something that I would want to kill myself. I mean, it's the defenses and taboos are just really, really high, maybe about as high as they are on any topic, I think.
I would say there is, anecdotally, professionally, in my training, in my treatment, in my work with patients, just as we said, personally, and just thinking of experiences of people, unfortunately, in my life that have, I don't know what, even the word we spoke about this, is it completed, committed, participated,
Yeah.
engaged in suicide, whatever it would be. And we can speak to that today, certainly, in the language itself having to be euphemistic and diplomatic because the violence or the homicidality or so it's taboo is such a good word. And what a disservice. And you'll agree with me, and the other people that I admire in the field will say that the irony of the taboo is that it makes it harder for people to get proper help, which was one of our motivations to having this conversation, is that you go to the therapist, and the therapist, being well-intended yet ill-equipped to manage somebody's suicidality and homicidality, which we'll unpack why those words are so related, of course, but that dynamic of venturing into the extraordinary oblivion or absence of being or existential insecurity to the levels of in depths that the day-to-day doesn't experience. And they say, oh, call this number, right? We'll kowtow to it. We'll defer. We'll externalize. On the you reminded me when you said it, the email header or the voicemail from the doctor, which drives me fucking insane. In my training, people spoke to that and said it's sort of a cop out because legally, as far as I understand, that's not really a thing. And yet, maybe
Everyone has it.
Everyone has it. Maybe for corporations or LLCs, it is. I don't know enough state by state, but I certainly recognize ethically it does nothing. And in fact, is alienating for the patient. But don't call me at this time. And if it's an emergency, call 911.
It's a very anxious thing. I can't even remember right now if my message, I know I had it for a while. I think I erased it thinking along these lines, but I may have put it back on there. I don't even know. I probably do have it because there is a way in which, no, but I mean, it is interesting. There's a way in which, just to be clear for everybody listening, when you call, most therapists or psychiatrists or, sometimes even like a clinic or whatever.
Yes.
At the end of it, they'll say, if you want, leave a message, but there'll be sometimes a kind of long spiel about if you're suffering this or this, or if you're suicidal, please go to 911 right now, which in some ways is kind of obvious, right? If you wanted to. But I think the downside of it is it does convey a kind of real anxiety and a kind of wall, like go away. I think
I am not equipped to manage or deal with the reality that your form of suffering is so severe so threatening to the integrity of my own ego function, my own self state, my own conceptualization of what it is to be myself and alive, that I need to push you away. I remember first being exposed to that in my institute training, and I was blown away by the counterintuition and sort of paradoxical nature of that reality. I'm like, holy shit, that makes a lot of sense. And because in my master's program, I was taught the language of the legalese of if it's an emergency, and especially because you're so inexperienced that you want to do the right thing, and if you and you're supposed to be deferential if you're ill-equipped or um,
Yeah.
uh, inexperienced, and say, okay, well, defer to my supervisor or the director or the clinic or the agency or the hospital or whatever. But for the individual, they're a human being, and now they even feel even more shame
Yeah.
or more guilt. If they have it in the family who doesn't know how to handle it, of course, which is very, very, very common, unfortunately so. The culture doesn't know how to handle it. And then
Yeah.
the professional doesn't know how to handle it. Where do they go?
It really is a disaster too, because if you're getting the signal from society, from your friends, from your clinicians, if you feel something, it's too big for me, even if that's implicit and not really true. And you start to think to yourself, oh my God, whatever I'm feeling, it's so big, I can't even think it. Whatever my feeling is, it's breaking down my thinking, and I just feel overwhelmed. That's the state, I think, which we want to discuss, in which acting out without thinking or without properly thinking something through occurs. And I do think one of the things that I was hoping that our podcast will do a little bit for is to just get people realizing that the capacity for thinking is what is needed in people who are feeling suicidal and thinking and talking and expressing and exploring. And that's what's often kind of starting to crumble as a result of difficult external and internal events.
To me, it's not only starting to crumble, it's crumbling.
It's crumbled. Yeah.
Or crumble. It's this inability to manage our own interiority. And we're not, again, I'm compelled to remind the listeners, or both of us, in the sense of we're not speaking to the exclusion of any causal variable, right? I always am sensitive to that it's both and, there are genetic loads, there are environmental loads, there are family loads, there are upbringing, there's causality everywhere, and influence and determinants and overdeterminants. And something with suicidality, or the study of, we recognize, and especially the people that are on the leading edge of this science, if you will, or art and science or humanity and science, recognize that there's so many variables. And statistically, that's why so many studies have failed. Another thing, forget about a replication crisis. It's just that you can't pinpoint through demographics alone or through word choice alone, which they've tried that, who is available in essence to such a form of crumbling, of implosion, and who isn't, and why. What are the defenses or the prerequisites that keep somebody upright in a prolific amount of burning, severe suffering, agonizing depression day to day, versus somebody else who says they can't do it anymore. And that misunderstanding too is incredibly frustrating in treating patients involved with that prolific amount of pain. The unsafety that if I attune to it, I'm afraid of the contagion. I'm afraid of the liability. I'm afraid of my own mortality. I'm afraid of my own fragility. I'm afraid of failing the individual or failing myself. I'm afraid of being sued. I mean, the list goes on. And yet we question, and then correct me where I'm wrong, and the listeners correct me where I'm wrong. Statistically, it's been the highest amount, post-COVID is the highest amount of suicide among whichever demographic that we've experienced in the country. I remember reading a few articles in Medscape and places like that were speaking to significant rises in major populations in the country, to the tens of, I believe it's tens of thousands of people a year, which translates to hundreds a day.
Whether you're looking at different places, the United States or Canada or Japan, or one thing we do know, I mean, this is super obvious, and it's just striking how little we talk about suicide given this. It is a leading cause of death amongst people, right? Like, and not only death, but really, like when people are 95 years old, you can say, oh, well, the flu is a leading killer of them. But like there is a way in which death is somewhat less traumatic in terms of how it ripples out. If a 95-year-old person dies, it's a loss, people grieve. But suicide is not only a leading sort of a killer of people, it also creates these massive ripples of trauma in everyone around them. which means is a public health problem. In a way, I think of it as the biggest public health problem we face, and we
It,
don't talk about it enough.
and we don't, in speaking to its public health concerns and sociological concerns, we don't speak to it we silo it, right? So we don't,
Yeah,
when it's studied and when articles transcend into some form of pop psychology or pop science, so they're speaking to it on the news or something, it doesn't include the people prior to the act. Let's say it's a successful act. We're not speaking to the millions, because now you're expanding that circle, right? Who's somebody who suffers from a form of suicidality, be it, just like we spoke to trauma, be it large or small.
yeah,
Then we're not speaking to the ripple effect. And then we're not speaking to the people, the taboo itself in relation to the persons or people suffering. And
yeah,
it always, to state that more clearly, it always boggles the mind in that it's never an individual, and it's never, maybe to bring it back to the homicidality, it's never alien to us as human beings in
that's right.
reality, but we treat it as if, oh, this person who did that is an alien creature.
Yeah,
They're or an invader, and I couldn't do that. I couldn't kill somebody. I couldn't kill myself. I couldn't participate in such horrors.
yeah.
And that's part of the denial, again, in the taboo. And then we're saying, how does this all happen? How is this proliferating?
Yeah, it is interesting. I just want to say one more thing about the taboo. And I think what you're saying now is getting us to kind of the core of what we really want to talk about too. The taboo is interesting. It almost feels even stronger than, if you read about like the Victorian era taboo about sex. And then
Right.
there's the sexual revolution, and people, still awkward in lots of cases to talk about sex, but people do talk about sex. But the level that we don't talk about suicide, given the intense importance of it in the world around us, is really astounding if you step back and look at it just for a second.
Just a little bit. And you say it's endemic to modern times. It's truly a leading cause of death among physiologically healthy people, so to speak. And yet, like you said, our hands are in the air.
Yeah,
The mental health crisis.
Yeah, death and family trauma, just, sometimes for generations. But the core part of what you're getting at, I think, is interesting. And I was trying to figure out how to articulate this a little bit just before we talked. And maybe there is a way in which we should distinguish, two cases where someone kills themselves or seeks assisted euthanasia, right? Like there are people who are getting very sick. They have a terminal illness. And whatever your moral position on euthanasia is, you can kind of put yourself in that person's shoes and say, here are their reasons for killing themselves. Here are their reasons not to. And I can kind of stretch my mind to understand what that person's world is like and how they're thinking, how it would be hard to think about those things. But it doesn't feel, as you were just saying, alien to ordinary experience.
No.
But because we kind of live in a world where we think the mind always operates primarily in these cognitive ways, like a person's thoughts are propositions and reasons for actions that have truth value. And if someone is acting badly or bizarrely, we can say, oh, well, they've just made an irrational assessment of what's true or what's false. Like we're very cognitive, I think, in our day-to-day appraisals of why people did things in the news or why our friends and family members did things. And I think that model, that kind of cognitive model, really starts to break down and doesn't work at all when you have a friend who kills themselves, because you start to say, like, well, I don't get it. I see that they were really going through something hard. But if you just look at their reasons for living and their reasons for dying, it seems like it would have been a reasonable decision to try to stay alive and keep going and see if you can get to a better future. But I think that idea about let's evaluate a person's reasons really doesn't work with the ordinary cases of suicide or the kind of dark suicide homicides we see in the news, where someone was seeking suicide by cop, for instance. We look at these cases and you hear people say, oh my God, I don't understand that. Why would anyone do that? And I think that's because they have this cognitive model and they kind of have pushed aside any layperson's notion of a more psychodynamic or psychoanalytic model of how the mind works.
Or more just empathy, like you said before, of an empathic model where we're so, there's a few things to comment on there. We're so accustomed, I forget if it was Soames or Friston or Panksepp, who said the idealization of cortical thinking. Maybe it was Turnbull. But we do live in a culture, right, where we idealize rationality, where we diminish the value of irrationality as if it has no causality, no value, no significance, no power, et cetera, et cetera. And that's certainly a component or an element to what's causing, among many, this phenomenon. Moreover, because we all are so guilty of that, we struggle so much to empathize, to stretch our minds, to understand, to mentalize or reflect on a capacity for somebody who could be in that much pain. But somehow it's not taboo. You make the good point that when it's euthanasia, when it's
That's
a
right.
terminal disease like a stage 4 cancer that is not receptive or not amenable to treatment, well, that, that kind of makes sense. Who would want to go through that pain? That's horrible. But when it comes to psychic suffering, or when it
That's right.
comes to, I am of the belief, and this is, I don't know what to call it, my informed opinion, my misinformed opinion, but I'm very much of the belief, and this might be my bias towards Freud in many ways, or we don't like the death drive. We don't like to
Yeah.
identify with this idea that of our destructive tendencies. And we really like, as a culture, and maybe this is a not egocentric, but maybe geocentric position in the culture I grew up in the Northeast. But we really don't like to say that we're capable of this, this monstrosity, and we fetishize it in so many ways. I was thinking of the Netflix shows, the Monster series on
Yeah.
Dahmer and Gein and the Menendez brothers. I'm sure there'll be one on Ted Bundy. It's like, oh, but they're fascinating. And then we love, back to the idealization of cortical thinking, we love, and this is reflective in our justice system, but we love motive to be univariate, causal, simplistic, devoid of complexity and synergy
Yes.
and emergent properties.
And
They did it
propositional.
because of X, right? And
Yeah.
propositional. They did it because of X, and that's it. There's
Yeah.
no way it's overdetermined. There's no way it's both and, to the point of an infinite amount of variables, overdetermined to your blue in the face. No way. They did it because of their mom. They did it because of social media. They did it because of SSRIs now. They did it because of their psychologist. They did it because of the president. And it's the intolerance is part of the problem, is that it just doesn't reflect the reality of the human experience at all.
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to make explicit, just so people really are following us, I think for both of us, you can disagree with me if you want, Max.
I love disagreeing with you. I'm going to do it all the time.
The states of mind that, somebody who maybe has a, long-running substance abuse problem, relational problems, who's like just overwhelmed, things are falling apart, who kills themselves. That's a relatively common event, one though that's still hard for us to really stretch our minds into it and empathize with.
Sure.
But there are similarities between that state of mind and someone who is, and also important differences, right, especially morally. But there are similarities between that state of mind and the states of mind where people are sort of overwhelmed with something internal and awful, and they go on a killing spree that is at least implicitly designed to kill them too, right? Like these kinds of horrible acts of suicide and murder. Not all of them, but some of them too are from states that you can only understand when you're thinking about suicidal states, really, truly dark states of mind, I think.
And it's that the shadow, to be a bit Jungian, right, that overwhelms because of its continued compression, disintegration, disowning, disavowal, what have you. And so the more we deny that shadow monster exists, the more expansive and powerful and sort of omnipotent it becomes. It's funny you said that, because I thought you were going in the other direction. Maybe a fourth example, is the celebrity suicide, where they say, I believe it, I apologize, it was Kate Spade. He spoke to Anthony Bourdain. I believe it was Kate. The word anymore, commit suicide, they die under their own hand.
Killed themselves.
And people are killed themselves. There's in the keyboard warrior, the absence of empathy and saying they have everything, it doesn't make sense. How could they be suffering? Right? They have whatever fame and fortune and the arrival fallacy that they've transcended human suffering or whatever it is. in the celebrity worship of our culture. And that one always really nagged at me like an earworm a little bit too, because these are humans as well, and we objectify them, talk about the idealization of rational of reason. We idealize them to the point of them being immune to their own humanity. The reasonable thing to do when you have $1 billion in fame and
That's right.
fortune is to live forever and do all the drugs and have all the like the hedonic, ideal, have sex with everybody, all the drugs, all the money, drive all the Ferrari. And it's like, at what point do you take the step back again and examine, like, when do you realize that these people, there's so many examples in the celebrity realm, they were people and in
Yeah.
pain. And just because they had a lot of money, it didn't inoculate them from their own humanity. It's very odd to me how objectifying that is, and how difficult it is for us to tolerate that they're human beings too.
It's a very common trope. I heard it most strongly with Anthony Bourdain, because I think some people just really loved him and saw him as somebody who's just,
I like that. Yeah, I like.
And they looked up to him.
I think he was a good guy.
And thought he was living a good life. I don't really remember paying much attention to him when he was alive. But, I knew people who did, who were big fans of his. And there is something really likable about him. He seemed very grounded and wise. And he had all these reasons to live: money, fame, being beloved, having all these, passions and interests in the world. He seemed to have a moral compass, right? And so he kills himself, and people say, I think this is often the explicit thing they say: how could somebody who had so many reasons to live and who seemed so rational kill himself? Well, I think that just underestimates that these irrational, unconscious, powerful forces are in everyone, including people who are, very successful. And those forces can be very destructive, externally and internally.
So what I want to bring that to make sure we get it into today's episode is the psychodynamic component, or maybe the interrelational component between self and object, and using Bourdain as an example of not just the reality that it's affect, the unconscious drives, instincts, whatever you want to call them, the unformulated components that give rise to conscious thought, feeling, behavior, convictions, beliefs, but it's understanding that it's a relationship. And we spoke to Andrew Solomon's writing on depression a little bit, among many other people. I hope the audience comments and has more writings for us to read. And the idea that, would you rather survive, and this is Solomon's writing, and I'm paraphrasing it, but it's survive in the burning apartment that's 50 stories up, or jump out the window to oblivion, right? To non-existence. And which is better? Which is less painful, in other words, and speaking to it, study of hedonism or anhedonia, I don't know. But it's fascinating how, back to the empathy, that we don't recognize that suicidality, this might be controversial, in my understanding, is homicidality, just on the internal or intrapsychic level. There is 100% of relational quality between the driving forces and the self-object, and the absence of maybe a self-concept in reality, or maybe you'd say a betrayal of ego function, depending on how you conceptualize it. There's two things here, the victim and the perpetrator. And that can happen inside of somebody, and yet we never conceptualize it.
I think one thing you have to wrap your head around to understand these states of mind, it kind of comes out most clearly when you see family members or loved ones of someone who has killed themselves, or maybe killed someone else and themselves at the same time. Is a person grieving is often feeling like a great deal of sadness for the person they lost. Like, oh, this poor person died and now they're gone and they must have been suffering so much. And that part is often a little easier to digest consciously if it's a loved one. But at the same time, I mean, and maybe this is controversial to say, but I think people feel this way, and it's unavoidable that we feel this way. The person who killed themselves is also someone who engaged in an act of killing, an intentional act of killing. They killed themselves, but they are themselves a killer. And loved ones really, I think, have trouble bearing this, that at the same time they feel sadness and love for the person they lost, but a real outrage and hatred, or all sorts of negative feelings, anger, at the person who killed. But it's the same person.
Right. That's the confusion. That's the ambivalence. That's the intolerance, again, for empathy. How do I hold on to my love and my hate at the same time? Quite simply, even though it's not simple, this person is the killer and the victim. And I loved them, or I worshiped them, or I idealized them, be it a close family member or a distant celebrity, sort of the same difference, just for the sake of dynamically speaking. And yet I can't tolerate that. So one of the ways that the taboo emerges as a defense against that ambivalence is to say, okay, well, that was an act of shame,
Yeah.
weakness, badness. We should speak to the religiosity component of that they go to
Hmm.
hell. It's the ultimate sin, another way to
Yeah.
distance ourselves from it.
Truly,
And
literally
we've
the
got,
ultimate
I'm
sin.
not good.
Yeah.
Right. And I have no compassion, therefore, because in that case, I identify with the killer as this sadistic monster who's undeserved of compassion or care or
That's right.
whatever. And then on the other hand is then the alienated family who, especially of the murderer, as opposed to somebody who commits suicide. And they say, but that was my mom, that was my dad, that was my brother, that was my sister, that was my cousin, that was my aunt. And you see, especially as we spoke to in the proliferation of true crime and as practice for these emotions and a safe way to distance but still experience, blah, 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 blah. We all fetishize it. These right now, we're recording this on October 10th of 2025. Right now, the number one show on Netflix, which I think is the biggest streaming service, is the Ed Gein monster serial
Oh,
killer
yeah, yeah,
show.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the serial killer in Wisconsin in the 50s
Yeah.
who had nothing going for him insofar as these overdeterminate variables. The hyper-religious mother, shaming, the persecution, a very significant genetic load that led to it, an underdevelopment of certain faculties and cognition. And the alienation or isolation of very post World War II, late 40s into 50s, in being in this farm town in Wisconsin. And it emerged into his,
Yeah.
psyche in person. He became a serial killer.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. So I just want to mention two things and try to tie them together. You just talked about the self relationship. I do think there is a way in which to really understand suicide. And again, you have to be careful not to make this too cognitive or conscious, but there's a kind of relationship between a person and themselves, like a marriage, that becomes so heated and intense that there's no dialogue anymore, no conversations about how should we relate to each other. There's just this need for a divorce. But of course, you can't divorce yourself. That's literally impossible. And so the only thing that kind of feels like that is an end, which is death, I think. Like some kind of acting out an escape, because the relationship between self and self has just become so awful. The other thing I wanted to say is it is interesting what you're saying about things like horror and true crime. We've been talking about how people don't like to think about this topic. It's too much. But I do think one place where people are trying to think about these darker states of mind is in literature about true crime stuff, and then also horror, where people's minds are like, okay, I do need to think about homicidality, suicidality, these really dark states of mind. And maybe I can do it in the context of something kind of fictional, where these feelings are sublimated about something that's only kind of real.
Moving towards that component, which there's so many to comment on here, I don't mean to do a disservice to any genuine question. How do you understand the interest, fetishization, passion for the true crime as homicidality? I'm thinking like Dateline or Law and Order, but one's fiction, one's nonfiction, but the nonfiction is kind of fictiony. These shows are decades long, and they've been on the air for 30 plus years. Yeah. But they don't involve, very few episodes involve suicidality. They often involve homicidality, almost always. Is that it's because of that alienation again, where that can be understood more non-empathically, more cognitively, because the person's acting out against another, and that's gross and disgusting, and I would never do that. But if it starts to talk about internal states of interrelational warfare, then, oh God, what do you mean? That person's a person, I'm a person, I'm not going to, and that scares the shit out of us. Yeah. That's my take. I don't know.
That probably, I get what you're saying, and that probably is true. Like, I was thinking of horror and true crime as a kind of case of the repressed. Like, we're always repressing thinking about murderousness, hatefulness, darkness. And those are one places where maybe we can think about those things, where it kind of comes back. But I think you're right. The reason that true crime and horror really don't tend to touch the subject of suicide, I think even metaphorically, is you're right. This is the ultimate repression. We don't like to think about suicide, or I'm sorry, we don't like to think about homicide and rape and child molestation. Understandably, we don't like to think about those things or the states that bring them on. In a way, if you look at horror carefully, it's rather clearly about those things. It's a way
Right.
of confronting those things in fiction. Yet even in fiction, I think we don't confront suicide very often. It's in
No.
the fiction of horror or in true crime. There aren't many true crime stories about this.
I'm thinking as a fan of these shows, I would say more movies. I would say, to reveal my own humanity, I would say I like horror movies in general. Like, I don't know what that
Yeah,
means, but a good one. And I'm thinking of the culture, the last good ones that say, oh, this is the horror movie of the year. And I'm thinking of like the slasher films of the 90s and the paranormal activities of the 2000s and the ghosts coming,
yeah,
Victorian stuff in Hereditary of the 2010s. All of them are very metaphoric. So the really good
for
directors and
sure.
writers, are really good at including relatable components in a sort of allegorical sense. So
Yeah,
this is the metaphor for addiction and alcoholism. This is the metaphor for religion and oppression. And I don't think you have to be like a film studies person to
they're
recognize
usually
that.
pretty
But
obvious in some ways. Yeah,
yeah, right. Yeah. The good ones are very good at incorporating all that. And yet I can't remember one I've watched that involved suicidality.
no,
Adolescence, if you saw on Netflix, did a good job. It's not suicidality, but did a good job of the family structure about a teenage boy. I don't want to spoil anything. It involves a teenage boy and homicidality in adolescence and in high school and that
yeah,
type of school shooting culture. And they do a very, 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 very impressive job of capturing the chaos and the ripple effect that you're speaking to, of how much it can destroy a community, a
yeah,
family, the vocation and avocational considerations and elements for everybody involved. And you
yeah,
say, it's that same thing back, maybe to tie it back in, of like the justice system is justice is served. This person is guilty. We know why they did it. They're going to jail the rest of their lives, or the death penalty. But then you see the people involved, the
yeah.
parent of that child or the child of that parent. What does jail do? I understand deterrence and taking them out of society. I get all that. But the idea that it rehabilitates anything or anyone, it's foolish. And we don't honor that either, because we don't honor the reality of what homicidality and suicidality is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one reason why true crime fiction and fiction in general might not have a good time helping us understand suicide, even though it does with homicide. Like I was thinking famous suicides like Marilyn Monroe. There'll be like these, old movies of the week
Right.
about her attempting suicide, right? At least, and like, she takes the pills, but it's always this like idealized version of her. It's not really trying to understand
No.
internal states that lead to suicide. I mean, maybe in literature, you can get some of that. But I was thinking, part of it is, I think this is a consequence of what we're saying, some of the concepts that you need to take seriously, I think our mind wants to reject them and call them bullshit. Like you and I were just talking about having a relationship to yourself. And I analogized it to like, there's some way in which it could be like a divorce. I bet there are listeners who are like, that's just bullshit. Like, what are you talking about? Relationship to yourself. Like that doesn't make sense. There is some way, I think, in which in order to really understand suicide, you can't accept only the kind of simpler, kind of universal psychological concepts that are often cognitive that we deploy. You have to. I'm thinking
Right.
of an example Winnicott gives. He in Fear of Breakdown, which I think we talked about. He had a patient. It's a very poignant and brief description. He said who had some psychosis. And she did eventually kill herself. And he doesn't talk much about his reaction, but you can tell from how he's writing that he is racked in some ways with guilt by this. And he writes that he thinks in retrospect, he obviously can't be sure, that if he'd been able to articulate for her and with her that part of her suicidal feelings were feelings that she had died already and that nobody understood this, that maybe it would have offered some relief and she could have understood what was happening in her in a way that wouldn't have led her to acting out to do it. Now, when you read that, or a person outside of our field reads that, they're probably like, what are you talking about? Like she died already and she could have, if it had been expressed. And maybe that's not true in this particular case of Winnicott's. It's just a hypothesis. But I do think like there's a way in which when the mind breaks down so much that you're just feeling like an overwhelming pain and horror, and the only out seems kind of an immediate action. I think it's hard for people to come up with concepts that really articulate what that would be like. It's hard to describe, and it's hard to depict in a movie.
It's hard to describe. It's seemingly possible or nearly. And that's one of the problems I agree with you that seems more inherent to the struggle to understand because of its intangibility, its ineffability, its idiosyncrasies, idiopathy, whatever. And all that individualized gobbledygook is so challenging, not because of anybody's fault. We're not speaking to the culture this time. We're speaking to, I would argue that it's inherent. And so if somebody who's never experienced the depths of that type of dread, where affect itself is coloring, suffusing conscious experience in a united front to the point where the person cannot mobilize themselves into life, that every day is agony, which is so foreign to some people.
Yes.
And that's arguably good, but that's wonderful that some people never experience that. They say exactly like you said, that's bullshit. There's no way, that it's better to. There's no way I could do that. Whatever veil, whatever rationalization, whatever management, of cortical thinking or deployment, like you said, it upsets me personally, professionally, this work as an analyst, passionate about it. The absence of empathy in this case is pathogenic. And it's contagious, as we're speaking to on all sides, but the action itself or the death itself, as well as the denial of it. And it's leaving us in dire straits. We're up Schitt's Creek without a paddle. And everyone keeps saying, what the fuck's going on? And we have the Today Show talking about the loneliness epidemic or the mental health crisis among adolescents. And they do a feel-good story about a school where they all take walks outside for mindfulness and they take, no cell phones allowed in school. And they're all singing Kumbaya. And we're like, what the fuck are you talking about, man?
It's a story.
Can we be a little bit realistic?
It's a story to help people feel better.
Honor the reality of the depravity of humanity that we're all capable of, and that taboo and censorship go against the authenticity of what it means to be alive. It drives me bananas. Sorry. But it's really upsetting because
it is upsetting.
Dealing with patients and people in real life, you feel it. You feel it. And I guess if you've never felt it, you don't.
Maybe not. Like I was thinking about it this way, that there's a lot of very simple psychodynamic or psychoanalytic concepts that maybe would help somebody who's never kind of gotten close to these states of mind, at least recognize there's something that I've never experienced that at least theoretically I could understand what it would look like if I started to go in that direction. So, in psychodynamic thought, we talk just about defenses, which can be as simple as like, I have this big problem in my life, but I have a tendency to just not think about it. They told me that I'm likely to die of cancer in the next 30 years, but I just, I don't think about it. I kind of just repress it. Fair enough. The defenses, we have to talk about them in culture as like being a problem, but they really help us manage psychologically difficult things, anxious, overwhelming, painful things. Or, maybe there's defenses. There's also a sense of like false self, like, oh my God, everybody's being awful to me and shaming me. Winnicott talks about you have a false self. You have this sense of like, look, I know how to manage people. Somebody's going to say something to me, but I kind of find a way to not let it affect me. I say to myself internally, that person's just an asshole. And I say something to them to placate them. Like I've got a system that's protective and defensive of managing people so that they can't hit at my inner core and really agonize me in a way where I can't protect myself. But I guess the question for the person who can't understand suicide is, what if your defenses aren't enough? What if your false self breaks down? Where do you go then? Right? You feel always like, oh, I could manage these things. If I had to go to jail, I'd be really awful, but I'd manage it. Or if my wife and family left me or died, like I'd grieve, but I know how to manage grief. But what if you didn't? What if those capacities in you stopped working? And I think all of us, if we're really honest, can get a hint of it. You're in a huge argument. You're having your worst day. You have a hint of what you start to get when the defenses and the false self aren't enough. And you really start to feel something where thinking and categorizing doesn't work. And then now imagine living in that over long stretches of time and see where you go. Would you go to somewhere more homicidal or suicidal to just kind of end it in a way.
Right. I think of the David Foster Wallace stuff, and he's obviously incredibly is just ingenious or
Yeah.
iconoclastic in his writing, and obviously his struggles are quite apparent with his own depression. And I always think of the fish to water thing. If you never
Yeah.
notice, the fish says beautiful water today, and the other fish says, what the fuck is water? He says,
Yeah.
you're in it the whole time. You recognize that same idea, same relationship or relatedness to the world or to ourselves or to others. I think you said very well of imagine your worst day. I almost to say comedians capturing that well, and not to comedians who've of course committed suicide.
Interesting. Yeah.
And thinking of, you get a flat tire on the way to work, you spill coffee all over yourself, and it actually burns. It's really hot. You're getting a demotion and a salary decrease. You find out your spouse is cheating on you. Your kid just got in big trouble. I don't know, got detention or something, suspended. You have no one to help you with that. And then when you get home from work that day, the Amazon package that you're really looking forward to is smashed, and you spent $1,200 on a Mac computer.
Yeah.
And it's broken, and you can't get it. They're not going to reimburse you. And imagine that, like, that's the way to do it. I think you're onto something. And
yeah.
And you list all the, and then you imagine the synergy, and then you imagine that day after day after day accumulate.
Yeah.
And that's a small portion,
Yeah.
Of that unformulated, nonverbal, elemental affect at our ground truth level that can't really be cogitated, sort of, at least cognified, because, and we struggle with that because we're so keen on it being rational or thoughtful. But the reality is, it's the feeling that suffuses. It's the color of all those things adding up. And then you're at the bar, having your whiskey or whatever, to be stereotypical. But every day you have to do that. And then whiskey stops working. Or whiskey's making you vomit or making you sick.
Or whiskey's also part of the problem. Yeah. But, Nietzsche says in the little passage called The Eternal Recurrence, he says, imagine at the end of the worst day of your life, a demon sneaks, into your room and says to you, I'm going to have you live this same day over and over and over and over and over infinitely. Like, what would your response be? And Nietzsche thinks the healthy, Nietzsche thinks like living a happy life means being able to say, this is a God. What wonderful news. Now, I think that's, like intense to say, but I do think there's something about the eternal recurrence and something about a lot of psychoanalytic thought that really require us to think like past the rational, past the defensive, past the self-protective, past the culturally appropriate. Like, there's stuff that if you're in it, that if you listen to a person who's in it, that can be understood and empathized with, at least to some degree, but you need to try. And I think there's a way in which people just don't try. And I think that's why this episode feels very passionate and important to me. Like, people need to try better to relate to their own states and to these people to really understand what's going on in the world, because otherwise we're blind.
I think it's a positive, if for lack of a better word, it's a positive note to end on. That it's almost to say you have to be able to empathize with yourself before you're going to be able to empathize with these states for the other. And if you can't tolerate a reality that you have the capacity, the affective capacity, we're not speaking to reason, that you have the feeling states that suffuse the mind or the heart in such a way, like your worst day, like the flat tire, like getting broken up with, like shitting your pants at work, whatever the thing is, or losing a loved one. And it's just agonizing. And then having to live with that the glasses you're wearing, the perceptive lenses, are now colored that way. They're shit colored. And that way, in empathizing with yourself, it does stretch you, in your words, to be able to empathize with the other. And that's like the handshake that could happen in our world to help people engage with
and tends not to.
Thank you so much. This was passionate. This was
we
intense.
got heated. Yeah.
I did not make enough jokes. I'm supposed to make like one joke per minute, I'm told by the algorithm. This was not this. Next time will have to be funnier.
I think we got to find something funny.
Yeah, we'll find something funny.